Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
Well, in the process of moving flat from London back to Deal, I've misplaced my iPad. I think there's a difference between misplacing and losing. I hope it isn't totally lost, but I can't find it. So if you see me squinting at my screen this morning, then that's why, and give me some grace with that. But it's really good to be able to speak to you this morning, and we're going to be continuing our series on Abraham to Jesus, exploring the genealogy of Jesus Christ and looking specifically at some of the individuals involved in that genealogy and exploring what we can learn from those people, I suppose. And what I've got to bring this morning, I think, follows on quite nicely from what Beth brought a couple of weeks ago, for those of us that were here 2 weeks back. And for those of us that weren't, she was talking about how God is able to move even in the biggest and dirtiest and grimiest of messes that we might find ourselves in. And today we're going to be looking at a man named Ahaz, who was the king of Judah for 16 years during an era that historians believe was probably 732 to 716 BC. And Judah was the southern region of the original Israelite territory, which was ultimately split into two as a result of the civil war that we read about in 1 Kings during the reign of King Rehoboam. And there are a few things that we should know up front about King Ahaz. He was 20 years old when he came to the throne, so relatively young. He was the son of Jotham, he was the grandson of Uzziah, and he was the great-grandson of Amaziah. And all of those men, we're told, did what was right in the eyes of the Lord during their reign as kings. They were good kings, they were godly men. So Ahaz came from good stock, he had good examples to follow, and when he came to the throne, Judah was in a really good place, spiritually. And there was a culture in Judah of following in the ways of the Lord and following in the will of God. But what we quickly learn about Ahaz is that, unlike his forefathers, he doesn't do what is right in the eyes of the Lord. And actually, despite those great examples that he had to follow, he chooses to go totally in the opposite direction. And that ultimately, we're told, is his downfall and the downfall of all of Israel. And we read about him in a few different places in the Bible. Most obviously in 2 Kings and also in 2 Chronicles in the Old Testament. But we're just going to read from the latter, from 2 Chronicles, chapter 28. I'm going to read from verses 1 to 8 and then verses 16 to 23 in the NIV. It's a little bit long, but please bear with me because I think it's important to hear all of this. And let's see if you can pronounce some of these names better than I can. So Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. Unlike David his father, he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He followed the ways of the kings of Israel, and also made idols for worshipping the Baals. He burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom, and sacrificed his children in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burned incense in high places, and on every hilltop and under every spreading tree. Therefore the Lord his God delivered him into the hands of the king of Aram. The Arameans defeated him and took many of his people as prisoners and brought them to Damascus. He was also given into the hands of the king of Israel, who inflicted heavy casualties on him. In one day, Pekah, son of Remaliah, killed 120,000 soldiers in Judah, because Judah had forsaken the Lord, the God of their ancestors. Zikri, an Ephraimite warrior, killed Messiah, the king's son, Azrikam, the officer in charge of the palace, and Elkanah, second to the king. The men of Israel took captive from their fellow Israelites, who were from Judah, 200,000 wives, sons, and daughters. They also took a great deal of plunder, which they carried back to Samaria. And then we'll just flick on to verses 16 to 23. At that time, King Ahaz sent to the kings of Assyria for help. The Edomites had again come and attacked Judah and carried away prisoners, while the Philistines had raided towns in the foothills and in the Negev of Judah. They captured and occupied Beth-Shemesh, Ajanaland, Gederoth, as well as Soko, Timnah, and Gimzo, with their surrounding villages. The Lord had humbled Judah because of Ahaz, king of Israel, for he had promoted wickedness in Judah and had been most unfaithful to the Lord. Tilgath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came, but he gave him trouble instead of help. Ahaz took some of the things from the temple of the Lord, from the royal palace, and from the officials, and presented them to the king of Assyria, but that did not help him. In his time of trouble, King Ahaz became even more unfaithful to the Lord. He offered sacrifices to the gods of Damascus who had defeated him, for he thought, since the gods of the king of Aram have helped them, I will sacrifice to them, so they will help me. But they were his downfall, and the downfall of all of Israel. So that was quite long, but just to break that down a little bit, it's pretty clear that Ahaz did some fairly horrendous things during his reign as king. He didn't just engage in idol worship, but he authorized idol worship on a massive scale. We're told that he did it in high places, on the hilltops, and under every spreading tree. So he authorized this huge operation of blasphemy against God. He took holy items from the temple and he used them in an attempt to bribe the assistance of other kings, which is a pretty detestable act. But worst of all, we read that he sacrificed his children in the fire. And actually, when we read the account in 2 Kings, we read more specifically that he sacrificed his son in the fire. And by doing this, he was buying into the detestable practices of nations that God had driven out in front of the Israelites previously in the Old Testament. And there was this idea in some of these tribes that actually if you were to sacrifice your children to these false gods, then you would bring favor on yourself by sacrificing something that precious. In 2 Kings 3, we read about the Moabite king doing this after a battle with the Israelites had gone against him. And it says, when the king of Moab saw that the battle had gone against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through to the king of Edom, but they failed. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice on the city wall. So whether this was through desperation at his ever-deteriorating situation, or whether it was just through pure stupidity, Ahaz thinks that this is going to bring him favor in the eyes of the gods. But of course it doesn't. So it's fair to say that, King Ahaz is up there with the most evil people we can read about in the Bible. And there are a number of bad kings we can read about in the Bible, but he is right up there with the very worst. He's about as far away from the will of God as anybody we can find. And yet, astonishingly, he is part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. If we were to cut off the lineage at Ahaz, then we never get to Jesus. And I think the first thing to say this morning is that no matter how dark or how desperate or how sad your life might feel in this moment and with whatever's going on around you, God can turn that into something amazing. And God can come into that situation and totally transform what's going on. Beth spoke a couple of weeks ago about Judah, a man who, through a series of ridiculous situations, manages to impregnate his daughter-in-law. And Beth said, how is it possible that from that mess can come Jesus? How unfathomable is it that that can happen? And this morning, regardless of what might be going on in your lives, regardless of how unfathomable it might seem that God can come and change that, it's really important that we know he can. And whether we like it or not, we will all find ourselves in these seasons in our lives. We'll all find ourselves in darker places when things go wrong. The Bible teaches us that that's a byproduct of the broken nature of this world that we live in. And it highlights why we so desperately need Jesus in our lives. And sometimes these things will be seemingly through no fault of our own. Sometimes things will just happen that we have no control over. But because of the broken nature of mankind, there will also be many times when we end up in darker seasons of our lives because of mistakes we have made. The Bible uses a word sin, which talks about our mistakes and our errors, and the times we mess up. And that does land us in trouble from time to time. And actually, the Bible teaches us a bit about this. And in a letter that the Apostle Paul writes to the Romans, he talks specifically about this situation. And the Apostle Paul wrote about at least 8 of the New Testament books, so he contributed a huge part of what we read in the New Testament. And he says this in the book of Romans: "So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man I am! Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord." And he goes on to say, "In all things, God works for the good of those that love him, who have been called according to his purpose." So this morning, it's really important that we understand that there is this war going on inside us. It's vital that we know there is an internal battle because of our human nature between what God calls us to do and what we know is right, and our human earthly inclination to go against that. That battle is going on right now in this world. I'm sure we see it all around us on the news, but it's also going on inside our hearts right now. And it's important we know that. It's also important, vitally important, that we know we aren't doomed because of that. Because as the Apostle Paul writes, we're saved from our sin, from our mistakes, from our errors by Jesus Christ and his death on the cross. But the third thing that it's really important that we do is to not become complacent with that. Not to become complacent with the fact that we aren't doomed and that we are saved by Jesus Christ. And actually, if we're serious about who Jesus is and what he's done for us and what that means for us eternally, then actually we should be making decisions on a daily basis which align us closer to the will of God. We should be proactively making decisions that draw us nearer to him as opposed to taking us further away. And let's just look at Ahaz as probably the perfect example of how not to behave when we find ourselves in those situations. Because in times of turmoil, our responses are so important. So what's happened here? Well, as we know, Ahaz has done a whole host of horrible, evil things. And as a result of that, God has handed him over to the Aramean army. They've defeated him in battle. They've taken many of his people as prisoners. God's also handed him over to the armies of the king of Israel, who've inflicted heavy casualties on him. We're told as many as 120,000 in one day. His son was killed in battle. His second in command was killed in battle. Then the Edomites came. They attacked him as well. They raided his towns. They carried off more of his people as prisoners. They've occupied parts of his land. So he sends to the kings of Assyria to help him. But we're told they bring him trouble instead of help. And he even goes to the extent of stealing holy artifacts from the temple in a bid to bribe kings to help him in his battles. And we're told that that fails as well. So for Ahaz, everything is going wrong. In this moment here, his life is a total and utter mess. And maybe you can understand a little bit about that this morning. Maybe you feel like your life right now is just a total disaster. And if that's the case, then I think we need to pay extra special attention to what happens next. Because for me, this line is the most pivotal line in this whole passage, which we read in verse 22, where it says, "In his time of trouble, King Ahaz became even more unfaithful to the Lord." In his time of trouble, he became even more unfaithful to the Lord. And for me, this is critical, because every single one of us in this room will come to points in our lives, pivotal moments, where we have to make key decisions. And we'll come to places where we have to decide we're either going to change the direction that we're going in, we're either going to consciously decide to change path, or we're going to decide that we're going to keep on ploughing down a road of destruction. But if we're going to make that decision to change, then we've first of all got to understand and got to accept and admit that we've made mistakes along the way. Let me tell you a slightly amusing story about a very dark time in my life to act as a metaphor for what I mean here. And when I was about 14 or 15 years old, I found myself in a situation where, let's just say, my inability to recognize that I'd made a mistake halfway through the situation ended up having pretty harrowing end results for me. So when I was about 14 or 15, I had quite bushy eyebrows. Some of you might know where this is going already. I had quite bushy eyebrows. And, I thought, I'm a pretty strong-willed character. It's not going to bother me if people think I've got bushy eyebrows. But, the comments started to come at school. There was monobrow being thrown about. There was werewolf eyebrows being thrown about. And, for a little while, I just sort of dealt with it and thought it's fine. And the breaking point was when I came home one day and my own father said, "Gosh, Joe, your eyebrows are getting a bit bushy." And I went, right, okay, I probably need to do something about this. But clearly I did not have the tools to conduct a thinning operation on my own eyebrows. And there was absolutely no way I was going to go to a salon and have anybody else do that for me. There was no way I was going to come to that place. So I came up with a plan. And I went to the bathroom upstairs and I locked myself in there. And I took out my Philips beard trimmer. And this was back in the days where they didn't have these hipster beard trimmers that we have now where you can adjust the length. There was none of that rubbish. It was on or off. It was all or nothing. And I was aware of this, so I thought, I need to be careful about what I do here. But I thought maybe if I just dabbed at my eyebrow, I'd be able to kind of thin it out a little bit. So the dabbing began, but it didn't take very long before I'd gone from full eyebrow to no eyebrow. Literally, totally gone. And now I was at my pivot point. I was at my mission-critical, potential life-changing pivot point, where I had to decide, am I going to admit that I've made a mistake here? And am I going to stop now, change direction, and salvage what I've got? Or am I going to just plow on down this road of destruction that I've begun to walk down and see where that gets me? And so in a moment of total and utter madness, I decided the best thing to do was to shave the other one off as well. Before realizing what a mistake I'd made. And still to this day, I promise you, I cannot understand what was going on in my head in that moment that I thought that was the best thing to do. But you know what? Sometimes in life, we are just so busy going full leather down that road that we're trying to make for ourselves, trying to get to that life that we're trying to build for ourselves, trying to get to that end goal that we think we desperately want, that even when it isn't mapping out the way that we want it to map out, we're just too proud to say, God, I've gone wrong here. God, I've gone in the wrong direction here. I've made a mistake. We're just too proud to make that U-turn and to follow God's path and put things right. And Ahaz was a man that made many mistakes. He made mistakes to the extent of which were levels of evil that hopefully none of us will ever, ever appreciate. But you know what? This here was his single biggest mistake that he made. It was that when he came to that pivot point, when he came to that life-defining, potential decision-changing moment, he decided that instead of changing direction and going with God, he was going to plow on even further in the opposite direction. And you know what? The longer we walk away from God, the longer we put off realigning ourselves with God, the more unfaithful we're becoming. And I think that verse is really profound because it could all have been so different for Ahaz. He had an opportunity here to change the direction that his life was taking. And what we're told in the end is that he arouses the anger of God and he dies at the age of 36, leaving nothing but a trail of destruction behind him. But this was his pivotal moment. This was the moment where he could have, to use a churchy word, repented for what he'd done. And that means to say sorry, to admit mistakes, and to realign himself with God. But he doesn't. And unlike so many other people that we read about in the Bible, that when they reach this moment, they change, and they choose the different path, and their lives are totally transformed forever. Probably the best example, I think, of somebody in the Bible that got this pivot point decision so critically right is found in the book of Luke in the New Testament, and in chapter 23, where we read about Jesus on the cross, and we read about two criminals who are next to him. And it says this: one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." And then he turned to Jesus and said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, you will be with me today in paradise. Could we find a better contrast in the whole Bible to King Ahaz in this second criminal? You know, these men were true criminals hanging next to Jesus. For all we know, they could have been just as evil and just as vile as King Ahaz. You know, crucifixion was a death penalty that was reserved for the very worst of mankind, for those that had committed the most evil and vile crimes. And it was a public event to deter other people from committing similar detestable crimes. And here we find a man in the middle of his own very self-inflicted, darkest time of trouble. A man whose sin has led him to the ultimate decision point, the ultimate potential pivot point. And unlike Ahaz, and unlike the other criminal, he chooses the right decision. And instead of standing there and continuing to plough down the road that he's ploughed down, instead of continuing to say, I've done things right, I'm going the right way, he humbles himself and he turns to Jesus. And that changes his life forever. His eternal destiny changed in a moment because he decided to change path and humble himself. And you know, King Ahaz actually made two major mistakes during his time of trouble. The first is that he intentionally chooses to go against what God is calling him to. And despite that great foundation that he had, he chooses still to go the wrong way. Because he would have known what following God's will looked like, because his father did it, and he'd have seen it during that time. He'd have maybe seen or at least heard of his grandfather as well, and the reign that he had. He would have known full well what it looked like to follow God's will, but still, even after everything's gone wrong, he can't bring himself to humble himself and follow Jesus. And that's his first mistake. But his second mistake is that he looks for an earthly answer to his problem instead of looking for a heavenly one. Now he says, since the gods of the king of Aram have helped them, I will sacrifice to them so that they will help me. You know, God had handed Ahaz over to the Arameans because of how disrespectful he'd been, because he hadn't followed the will of God. But Ahaz reads that as, oh, these guys have got the solution. Whatever they're doing, I need to be doing because I want to get to the same end result that they're getting to. So either he lacked so much self-awareness to understand what was going on, or he was just plain stupid. But whatever it was, his response was an idiotic one, and we're told explicitly that was his downfall. So what does that mean for us today? What are the key things that we can learn from King Ahaz? Well, I think it can be summarized into 3 points. And the first of which is when we find ourselves in times of trouble, whether self-inflicted or whether through no control of our own, whatever response we choose is incredibly important. And whichever response we choose is also a very intentional one, because we can either choose to intentionally lean further into God in those seasons. We can spend more time with him. We can pray more to him. We can read the Bible more in those seasons. Or we can choose to just blindly continue down the path that we're on. And the longer we put off realigning ourselves towards God, the more unfaithful we become. And secondly, when things go wrong in our lives, the biggest potential challenge that we face is overcoming our pride. Are we prepared to actually admit that we've got it wrong? Are we actually prepared to come to that place where we say, you know what, God, I've gone the wrong way here? Because until we do that, we can't change. And that involves a lot of humility. And then thirdly, I think we can learn from Ahaz that it can be a massive mistake to look at other people around us, to see what they've got, to analyze the success of their lives, and then to try and mimic their behavior to get to the same result. You know, the Arameans were not godly people. They were serving false gods for a start. But yet to Ahaz, it seemed like they had everything that he wanted. And his massive mistake was thinking that was the formula to success in his life, trying to mimic what he'd seen other people doing. And maybe that's you this morning. Maybe you know that you're in a place where you're looking at what other people have, and you're building your life around trying to get to the same place. Maybe it's marriage, maybe it's financial success, status, beauty, a friendship group, whatever it is. Maybe you know that you've been aligning your life, chasing those things, and it's led you down a path which hasn't got you to where you want to be. You know you're not happy. You know you're not in the flow of what God is calling you to. And maybe today, you first of all need to admit that you've made mistakes so that you can change the path that you're on. Or maybe you're just in a really tough season of your life today. Maybe through no fault of your own, you're in a really, really tough place. And it feels like God hasn't been on your side through that. And you know that's led you to a place where you're pulling away from him rather than drawing closer. Or maybe you're here today and you've never actually made a commitment to follow Jesus. Maybe you've never come to that place, but you know today that you're approaching that pivot point in your life where you've got to decide to either totally transform and change direction, or to keep on going down the road that you've always gone down and you always felt was the right one. But either way, there's always an opportunity here at Living Well for prayer or to talk with somebody. And as we sing our closing song today, I'll be at the front if you want to come and chat or pray about anything. And especially if you'd put yourself in that third group. If you know that you've never really made that potential pivot, potential life-changing decision, and you want to do that this morning, then I would love to chat with you afterwards. But I really felt on my heart that there were people here today who are mature Christians, have been Christians for a long time, maybe. But you know deep down that you've been ploughing down the wrong road for a long time, trying to get somewhere. And you know you're not there, and you know you're not happy physically or spiritually. And today, if that's you, I just challenge you to humble yourself, to admit that you've got it wrong, and to allow God to come and do that transformational work in your life. And there's no better way to challenge you than to say, don't be like Ahaz. Don't let your pride get in the way this morning of that potential life-changing decision. But be like the second criminal, who in his darkest moment, in his moment of real trouble, allows his humility to be his absolute life-defining decision. Amen.